It's time to wise up on Metroidvania Works episode 20. As RPG fever engulfed the Japanese console market, we saw quite a few interesting genre mashups as a result, and each of them seemed to key in to a different source of inspiration. By 1989, the concept of role-playing game had been distilled by some of these proto-Metroidvania creations to such a degree that they barely even resembled actual RPGs. For example, the Battle of Olympus took most of its design notes from Zelda II, which in turn combined Dragon Buster with the original Zelda, which in turn owed much of its personality to Xanadu and the Tower of Duraga, which themselves seemed like a melange of Atari's adventure, wizardry, and other primal works from the 1970s. So when Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys shifted gears to take the form of a side-scrolling sword combat adventure in the wake of the top-down design of the first two games in the series, you could be forgiven for simply assuming that developer Nihon Falcom had simply decided to churn out yet another Zelda II knockoff. And perhaps that was the original impetus behind the series' format shift. Zelda II ended up being quite widely imitated in the latter half of the 80s, but calling Ys 3 a mere Zelda II clone would be too reductive, too inaccurate. No, Ys 3 gamely adapts the essence of Ys into side-scrolling form, with all that entails. Structurally, it really does resemble the earlier games, a fairly compact adventure with only a few dungeons and bosses, an inventory grid whose limited setup hints at the brevity of the quest, and an emphasis on sprawling dungeons that no human could possibly complete on their first go. Ys 3 incorporates the full totality of the vintage Ys experience into its new format, and that even includes interpreting bump combat for side-scrolling. The original Ys games featured blazing fast battles that consisted of protagonist Adol Christen ramming into enemies at full steam, either inflicting damage on his target or smacking into that monster off-center, thus causing his sword to miss its mark and resulting in Adol dying almost immediately. That approach wouldn't make much sense in a game where Adol runs and jumps and enemies largely attack along perpendicular planes to Adol's position. So instead, Ys 3 turns Adol's sword skills into very nearly an auto-battle ability. Unlike in Ys 2, you need to press the attack button in order to brandish your sword, rather than Adol permanently wielding it. But unlike in slower-paced games, you can turn it into a rapid-fire attack by simply holding down the action button. Adol still has Link-like sword techniques, including a downward aerial thrust, but the bulk of combat in Ys 3 comes down to walking around with the fire button depressed so that Adol trails behind a perpetual swipe of bladed death. This allows you to set up auto-leveling farms pretty easily. Simply place Adol in a location where he can reach enemies, but not vice versa, secure the attack button, and let nature take its course for an hour or two. Far from being a cheap exploit, this honestly seems to be a deliberate design choice. Leveling up in Ys 3 is every bit as crucial as in the older games. Advancing even a single experience level makes a massive difference to Adol's physical attack power and his defensive strength. When the game first opens, he is almost guaranteed to die on the first screen to the mindless insects that zip past. They take multiple hits to destroy, while absolutely demolishing Adol in a few hits. And as Ys 3 carries forward the older game's lack of any real mercy invincibility when you take damage, you can literally wade through the 10-minute opening cutscenes and town exploration only to die a few seconds into the first dungeon. So Ys 3 demands that you grind for experience. The grinding here feels different from that of, say, Willow, because those two games have a radically different perspective on the nature and outcome of leveling. In Willow, level-ups boosted the hero's maximum hit points and mana points, but otherwise had no impact on strength or endurance. Willow had to rely on his gear to improve his numerical combat prowess. Instead, his experience levels manifest in a tangible, almost tactile way by giving him greater skill with the powerful swords he acquires along the way. By tying Willow's actual in-game dexterity to his weapons in a meaningful way, the game forced players to make hard choices about their sword selections and rewarded them for leveling up without making them feel like they needed to stand around and grind too much. Ys 3 adopts a much older school perspective when it comes to experience systems. Raising your levels also boosts your max MP here, but it doesn't change anything else besides the mathematical formulas applied to your collisions with enemies. But this is by design, just like the fact that the ideal way to play is to hold down the attack button at all times. Even in 1989, Falcom approached the action RPG with an emphasis on the stat crunching of the RPG. In particular, the designers took inspiration from the old-school strain of the genre that the company's designers had cut their teeth on. Things like wizardry, which sent players out into the world weak as a newborn kitten and forced them to linger and fight at the very outset of the adventure in order to beef themselves up enough to make a proper foray into the larger world. Ys 3, like Ys and Ys Book 2 before it, reinterpret this mindset through the lens of an action format, imposing that archaic requirement on players but cranking up the speed to maximum so that it hardly takes any time at all to complete. This is dated design by 1989, but deliberately so. Falcom clearly put plenty of thought into the balancing of Ys 3. Once you raise Adol's levels to the point that he can steamroll the generic mobs in a dungeon, he'll have reached the precise point at which bosses can still annihilate you in a matter of seconds if you don't know how to approach them. Yet, you do have a fighting chance against them. But did Ys 3 really have any actual impact on the evolution of the Metroidvania? I'd say no. It's more of an isolated tidal pool of game design outside of maybe influencing the shape of largely forgotten action platform adventures on Japanese PCs in their twilight days. Like a lot of games we've seen around this time, Ys 3 abandons the idea of a fully interconnected world in favor of allowing players to select destinations on a world map. Unlike in Bionic Commando or Clash at Demon Head, you have only a few destinations to choose from, and they become available once you complete specific story objectives, leading to a linear adventure. In a nice nod to series conventions, though, each standalone destination does have an outdoor space where Adol can step away from the cave and swiftly regenerate his hit points. Between these little grace notes of design continuity and the emphasis on grinding for levels and auto-attacking foes, Ys 3 doesn't really feel like an attempt to advance game design so much as an effort to reframe the rules of the Ys series to keep it up to date with contemporary trends. Not unlike the Zelda series, Ys would revert to its earlier style for the next game, though by Ys 6, much of the innate character of the franchise would have become largely lost. Thankfully, Ys 7 struck the perfect balance for the series, introducing on-the-fly character shifts and an emphasis on instant evasion to the speedy top-down action. A style that built on an excellent remake of Ys 3 from 2005 called The Oath at Felghana. But even if Ys 3 didn't do much to drive the evolution of Metroidvania design, it remains an interesting experiment in combining foundational RPG thinking with high-speed scrolling combat. The Metroidvania as dungeon crawler. As for the pure action RPG entry this episode, we have a cooperative brawler, a sequel to Renegade and counterpart to Double Dragon. Yes, somehow all of these things are true. Technos Japan's River City Ransom shipped in Japan as the direct sequel to Renegade, introducing cooperative two-player support and completely breaking away from the linear stage-by-stage design of its predecessor, and in fact of the entire burgeoning brawler genre that had emerged in Renegade's wake. River City Ransom had some degree of precedent in Technos' other Renegade sequel, Double Dragon. The development team behind the NES port of that game either chose not to or lacked the ability to incorporate co-op play into that release, so they added some remarkably forward-thinking bonus elements in its place. Most obviously, Double Dragon on NES included a one-on-one fighting mode where two oversized characters, or rather, two oversized sprites of the same character, could beat one another down. It was primitive, but it was the first take on what we would consider a modern-day fighting game to ship for a console in the wake of Capcom's Street Fighter. At the same time, the standard story mode also underwent a significant change in order to give its design a little more heft, despite the loss of a second player. Double Dragon played solo lacks much of the core appeal of the game, which involves raucously strategizing with your partner to corral foes and rescue one another from tight spots, all of which becomes lost in the one-player format. So Technos looked to the RPG mania that had seized console game makers across Japan at that point and added an experience-based leveling system to Double Dragon, locking all but the most basic of the player's skills behind performance-based objectives. Players earned a certain amount of experience for each action they performed, earning extra points for pulling off more difficult moves, and once that experience tally reached a certain point, they'd level up and learn a new ability. It was an interesting idea, but not one that really lent itself to freedom of play. After all, Double Dragon contained 4 stages that players could reasonably complete in 15 to 20 minutes. All the leveling system really did was pad out playtime by encouraging players to grind up their skill points. With River City Ransom, Technos went back to the drawing board and made these RPG-inspired mechanics a central underpinning of the game rather than a last-minute addition. The end result is by far the most sophisticated brawler of the 8-bit era, and one frankly unrivaled by other genre efforts throughout the 1990s, outside of Technos' own projects and a few standouts like Capcom's Dungeons & Dragons and Treasure's Guardian Heroes. River City Ransom incorporates an actual economy, permanent skill and stat boosts, an open game world consisting of safe areas where you can refill your health and buy upgrades and consumable items, and even, yes, cooperative play. It is an RPG in every meaningful sense of the word, but one in which punching and kicking and throwing random debris replace menu-based combat, and one where you can team up with a friend. River City itself, which is simply a suburban portion of the Tokyo metro area in the Japanese release, more or less consists of a long straight line from the journey's beginning to its end. Laid out on paper, it looks a lot like the world of Simon's Quest, minus the eventual loopback and baffling dead ends. So, on a very fundamental level, River City Ransom works a lot like a normal brawler, as you move left or right across various environments, beating up guys and crushing bosses in order to gain access to the next level. The difference between River City Ransom and, say, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which debuted in arcades around the same time as this Famicom cartridge launched, is that you have full run of River City from the outset. You can theoretically travel the breadth of the town, assuming you can survive against the increasingly powerful mobs of enemies that lurk beyond the opening zone. Progression in River City Ransom takes place on two axes: character growth and narrative advancement. You upgrade your characters with the power of capitalism. Collect cash from fallen enemies, then spend it at shops to acquire items that confer statistical gains or teach you new techniques. In the early going, protagonists Alex and Ryan have only basic combat abilities available to them and can't take much of a beating, but as you invest in enhancements, they grow in speed, power, and technique. On the narrative advancement front, it doesn't really matter if you manage to somehow fight your way to the end of the game from the moment you first enter the fray. Like reaching Death Mountain before you've conquered a single dungeon in The Legend of Zelda, all you get for your hard work fighting past devastatingly deadly enemies to skip ahead is a lockdown final dungeon, that is, school building, that you can't enter until you go back and complete certain prerequisites. Specifically, you need to meet a handful of allies and defeat the various bosses that your rival Slick has installed around town. If this were a standard brawler, you could achieve this feat in probably 15 minutes. But the RPG-style systems woven throughout the game's fabric make this more easily said than done. Even the first boss can curb stomp you, if you approach them with your default stats and skills. And you can just forget about besting the later bosses. Even some of their generic henchmen can pulverize a level 0 Alex in a single blow. So you need to spend time earning the cash for the skill boosts that will enable you to stand toe-to-toe with the enemy. And that means you need to do a lot of brawling against standard mobs, since they drop money when defeated. The grinding here never feels as rote as in Ys 3 because it offers more involvement, at least until you learn all the advanced techniques that allow you to automatically rapid-fire your way through mobs and bosses alike, just like Adol. And in any case, why play a brawler if not to beat up legions of dudes? River City Ransom doesn't really do anything for the Metroidvania genre, but it's worth mentioning as an action RPG sidebar simply because it offers the best demonstration we've seen to date of the potential inherent in hybrid role-playing mechanics. Bringing stats, freedom, and persistence into the brawler format not only breaks the game from the rote rigidity that had already begun to define this nascent genre, it brings more purpose and more enjoyment to the underlying premise of the brawler. It also opens up the game to more casual players. You might not be able to beat the hardest parts of challenging 8-bit action games, but River City Ransom allowed players to build up their stats to the point that their hero's sheer inherent power overwhelmed all enemies without any actual need for skill. That was a big part of what made Dragon Quest so appealing, and a significant element in making its mini derivatives so popular. It would also be an integral component of the true Metroidvania games many years later. That is, the stat-driven Castlevania games directed by Koji Igarashi, which allowed players to crank up their heroes via determined repetition to minimize the need for actual skill. Capital G gamers can argue about the validity of this design philosophy all they like, but either way, it's certainly given River City Ransom a far longer life than any other brawler of the 8-bit era. So clearly, Technos did something right here. Next time on Metroidvania Works, The Wonder of New.